Henry Lawson sat in his penthouse office, staring out at the city that never slept. The endless lights of Manhattan stretched below him, a constant reminder of his success. He had everything a man could want: power, money, control. But there was one thing he didn't have, and that fact gnawed at him like an old wound. An heir. At 43, Henry had long abandoned the idea of love. Relationships were distractions, messy, and unpredictable. He had been married twice before, and both times had ended in bitter disappointment. Women wanted his money, not him. He had learned that the hard way. But legacy? That was something real. Something permanent. And tonight, he was going to secure it. The exclusive lounge was bathed in dim lighting, the scent of cigars and expensive whiskey filling the air. This wasn't a place where ordinary men did business. It was a place for those who controlled the world behind closed doors. Henry sat in a private booth, a sleek black tablet in his hand, scrolling through carefully selected profiles. Every woman on the list had been vetted, healthy, discreet, and financially desperate enough to accept the arrangement. No emotional attachments. No complications. And then, he saw her. Leah Carter. Henry's hand froze over the screen. A strange sensation ran through him, something unfamiliar and unsettling. Messy brown hair, striking green eyes. There was something about her face, something just out of reach in his memory. But he pushed the thought aside. It didn't matter. She fit the criteria. Age, at 29. Medical history, a clean. Background, a single mother. No family support. She's the one, Henry said, tapping the screen. The broker sitting across from him nodded approvingly. Good choice. She's fully briefed on the terms. Once the contract is signed, there's no going back. No emotions, Henry muttered. No complications. Exactly. Henry leaned back in his chair, satisfied. He was in control. For now. Leah sat in front of him, her fingers gripping the edge of her chair so tightly her knuckles turned white. Henry studied her, his expression unreadable. She was smaller than he had expected. Her file had said 5 feet 6 inches, but sitting across from him, she seemed almost fragile. But something about her posture told him otherwise. There was a quiet strength in her. The thick stack of legal papers sat between them on the polished oak table. The contract that would change both of their lives. I assume you understand the terms, Henry said, his voice sharp, businesslike. Leah nodded, but she didn't speak. 1 year, he continued. You'll carry the child. After birth, you'll leave. In exchange, you'll receive full financial compensation. Enough to take care of you for life. Leah reached for the pen but hesitated. Her fingers trembled slightly. Henry frowned. If you have any doubts, this is the time to speak. She looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time. And for a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Something familiar. Something resentful. Henry's chest tightened, but he didn't know why. I understand, Leah finally said, her voice quiet but steady. She signed the first page. Then the second. Then the third. Her hand was shaking. And yet, she never looked away from him. Henry watched her carefully, an unsettling feeling creeping into his mind. He should have felt satisfaction. Relief. Instead, he felt like he had just made a terrible mistake. And Leah? She wasn't just signing this contract for the money. She had come here for something else. Revenge. Henry had dealt with thousands of business transactions in his life, but this one left an unfamiliar taste in his mouth. He sat alone in his study, the thick legal documents still resting on his desk. The ink on Leah Carter's signature was barely dry, yet something about it felt off. He had done everything right, carefully vetted candidates, ensured confidentiality, structured the contract to eliminate any risk of emotional involvement. It was a flawless deal. And yet, for the first time in years, Henry felt uneasy. It wasn't the contract itself. It was her. Leah Carter. There was something about her that he couldn't shake. The way she looked at him, the way she hesitated before signing, as if she knew him in a way he didn't understand. Henry shook his head, dismissing the thought. It was just his mind playing tricks on him. 3 days later, Leah arrived at his estate. Henry had instructed his assistant, Richard, to handle all arrangements. The woman was not his problem. He wasn't going to waste time worrying about how she was settling in. But when he passed the grand staircase and caught a glimpse of her standing in the hallway, suitcase in hand, he found himself stopping. She was dressed simply, dark jeans, a fitted sweater, her brown hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. No expensive jewelry, no designer clothes. She looked exactly as she had in the photo. And yet, standing in his house, she looked out of place. He didn't know why that bothered him. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, something passed between them. A flicker of recognition. A spark of something unspoken. Then she looked away, her expression unreadable. Richard, ever efficient, cleared his throat. "Miss Carter, I'll have the house staff show you to your room. If you need anything." "I won't," Leah interrupted, her voice flat. "I'll be fine." Something about her tone irritated Henry. Most women in her position would be grateful. Nervous, perhaps. But she seemed indifferent. Like she was here for something else. Like she wasn't afraid of him at all. The first few days passed without incident. Henry barely saw her. She kept to her wing of the house, following the medical protocols set in the contract. Routine checkups, diet regulations, early prenatal care. Everything was in order. And yet, Henry found himself thinking about her more than he wanted to. It was absurd. She was just a means to an end. And yet? Late one evening, as he poured himself a drink in the library, he heard soft footsteps. Turning, he saw Leah standing in the doorway. She wasn't dressed for bed. She still wore the same sweater and jeans, as if she hadn't intended to stay long. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Henry broke the silence. "What are you doing here?" Leah tilted her head slightly. "Am I not allowed in this part of the house?" "You can go wherever you want," he said evenly. "But I didn't expect to see you here." She stepped inside, glancing at the towering bookshelves. "You actually read these, or are they just for show?" His jaw tightened. "I read them." She nodded, as if filing that information away. And then, unexpectedly, she walked over to the bar and poured herself a drink. Henry watched, irritation flickering in his chest. "You shouldn't be drinking." Leah smirked. "Relax. It's just water." That annoyed him more. She was testing him. For what reason, he didn't know. "You don't act like someone in your position," he said, watching her carefully. She raised an eyebrow. "And how am I supposed to act?" "Grateful." She laughed softly, but there was no warmth in it. Henry felt something inside him tighten. There was something about her laughter that bothered him. It wasn't the sound. It was the fact that it felt personal. Like she was laughing at him. That night, Henry barely slept. Leah Carter was a stranger. So why did she feel familiar? He tried to shake it off. It was just a trick of the mind. A passing resemblance to someone he had once known. But as the days passed, his unease grew. Leah wasn't just distant. She was watching him. He caught her looking at him more than once. Not with fear, not with admiration, but with something colder. Sharper. Like she was studying him. He wasn't used to that. People feared him. Respected him. But Leah? She looked at him like she knew something he didn't. And Henry Lawson didn't like feeling out of control. Henry had never been a man easily rattled. His life was built on logic, control, and a strict separation of emotions from business. Yet, ever since Leah Carter had stepped into his house, something inside him had shifted. He hated to admit it, but she unsettled him. It wasn't anything obvious, she wasn't loud or dramatic. In fact, she barely spoke to him at all. She kept to herself, following the contract's terms without complaint. But it was the way she existed in his space, the way she watched him, that disturbed him the most. She wasn't curious like most people who entered his world. There was no awe in her gaze when she looked at his estate, no hesitation in the way she moved through the halls of his mansion. She looked at him as if she already knew who he was. And worse, as if she had already judged him. Henry wasn't used to that. Most people either feared him, envied him, or wanted something from him. Leah? She seemed utterly indifferent. But something told him that her indifference wasn't real. One evening, he found himself in his private gym, pushing himself harder than usual. The weights clanked loudly as he forced his muscles through repetition after repetition. It was ridiculous. He shouldn't care what she thought of him. Yet, when he saw her pass by the open doorway, pausing briefly before continuing down the hall, he felt a surge of irritation. "What?" he snapped, dropping the barbell onto the rack. Leah stopped, raising an eyebrow. "What?" "You were staring," he accused. She tilted her head slightly, eyes calm, unreadable. "I was walking." Henry wiped the sweat from his forehead with a towel, trying to shake the tension coiling in his chest. "You watch me." "I've noticed." For a moment, she didn't respond. Then, she took a step closer. "Does that bother you?" Something in her voice made his muscles tighten. Henry wasn't sure what he expected her to say, but he certainly wasn't prepared for what she said next. "It's just funny," Leah mused, folding her arms. "You spend so much time controlling everything around you, but deep down, you have no idea what people actually think about you, do you?" The statement hit him harder than he cared to admit. His expression darkened. "I don't need to care what people think." Leah gave a small, almost pitying smile. "Right. Of course, you don't." And then, just like that, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, fists clenched at his sides. For the first time in years, Henry felt like he had lost ground in his own home. That night, sleep didn't come easily. The following morning, Henry told himself he was overthinking things. It wasn't like he spent his days thinking about Leah Carter. She was nothing more than a contract. And yet, when he entered the dining room for breakfast, his eyes immediately went to where she sat at the far end of the long table. She had barely touched her food. Henry took his seat, trying to ignore her presence. But as the silence stretched, the irritation from last night still lingered in his chest. "You're not eating," he noted, keeping his voice neutral. Leah glanced up. "Not hungry." Henry set his coffee cup down. "That's not acceptable. You carrying my child. Your health is a priority." Leah let out a small, humorless laugh. "Of course. That's what matters, isn't it?" There it was again. That tone. That quiet defiance wrapped in something colder. Henry leaned forward slightly. "What exactly is your problem?" Leah met his gaze without flinching. "Nothing. I'm here, aren't I? I signed your contract. I'll follow the rules." There was an unspoken but at the end of her sentence. Henry exhaled sharply, pushing away from the table. He wasn't going to play this game. "Make sure you eat," he said, standing up. "I don't have time for nonsense." He expected her to ignore him, to let him have the last word. But as he turned to leave, she spoke again. "You really don't remember me, do you?" Henry froze. His pulse hammered once, hard, before steadying again. Slowly, he turned back to her. "What?" Leah leaned back in her chair, watching him with something close to amusement. "Never mind." She stood, pushing her plate away. "I'll make sure to eat, Mr. Lawson." And then she walked out of the room, leaving Henry standing there, his mind reeling. He didn't move for several seconds, staring at the place where she had been sitting. She was lying. He didn't know her. He would remember. Wouldn't he? Henry didn't consider himself a man prone to obsession, but Leah Carter's words had taken root in his mind like a splinter he couldn't remove. "You really don't remember me, do you?" He wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to another one of her little games. But something about the way she said it, so calm, so certain, unsettled him. And that was what irritated him the most. Because if she was telling the truth, then that meant he had missed something. A detail. A connection. And Henry Lawson didn't miss details. That night, long after the house had gone quiet, he sat in his office, scrolling through files on his laptop. Leah Carter. Age, 29. No criminal record. No notable family ties. Graduated from a small college in Ohio. Single mother. Nothing stood out. Nothing connected them. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. It was ridiculous. A waste of time. She was no one. And yet? The next morning, he caught himself watching her. She moved through the house like she belonged there, but he could tell, she didn't feel at home. She wasn't curious about his wealth, wasn't interested in luxury. She barely acknowledged the staff, never made requests, and spent most of her time in the garden or the library. Avoiding him. And for reasons he couldn't explain, that irritated him. It wasn't that he wanted her attention. He just didn't like being ignored. Henry found himself passing by the library more often than necessary. He told himself it was coincidence. Until, one afternoon, when he stepped inside and found her standing in front of the massive bookshelf, running her fingers over the spines. She didn't turn around. "You always this nosy?" he asked, leaning against the doorway. Leah didn't jump, didn't even flinch. She simply pulled a book from the shelf and turned it over in her hands. "I didn't expect you to have this one," she said, ignoring his question. Henry frowned. "What?" She turned, holding up an old, worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. The edges were frayed, the cover barely holding together. Something tightened in his chest. It was his mother's book. One of the few things he had kept after she died. He hadn't touched it in years. "You read it?" she asked, tilting her head. He hesitated. "A long time ago." She nodded, almost like she already knew the answer. He stepped closer. "Why do you care?" Leah closed the book and placed it back on the shelf. When she looked up at him, her expression was unreadable. "You don't remember," she murmured, almost to herself. There it was again. That same damn sentence. Henry's patience snapped. "Remember what?" Leah studied him for a long moment, and then, she smiled. Not the kind of smile people gave when they were amused. The kind people gave when they held a secret over you. Then she brushed past him and walked out of the library. Leaving him standing there, fists clenched, feeling like he had already lost a game he didn't even know he was playing. The report from his private investigator sat in front of him, but it gave him no answers. Henry had expected something, anything, that would explain why Leah Carter felt so damn familiar. But there was nothing. Her records were clean. No connections to him, no history that overlapped with his. A simple, struggling single mother with an unremarkable past. Yet his instincts told him otherwise. Henry wasn't a man who ignored his gut, and right now, his gut was screaming that something was wrong. His jaw tightened as he flipped through the report one more time, as if the answer would magically appear if he stared hard enough. It didn't. Frustration burned in his chest. He had built his empire on control, on knowing every possible outcome before it happened. But Leah? She was an unknown variable. And he hated unknown variables. A knock at his office door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," he said, his voice sharper than he intended. Leah stepped inside. For a brief moment, he just looked at her. She was wearing a simple dress, her hair pulled back into a loose ponytail. Nothing extravagant. Nothing that should make his pulse skip. And yet, it did. She noticed his expression and raised an eyebrow. "Something wrong?" Henry closed the file and leaned back in his chair. "Should there be?" Leah shrugged. "You look like you just lost a very important game of chess." Henry exhaled slowly, studying her. "I had my investigator look into you." She didn't react. No shock, no anger. Just acceptance. Like she had expected it. "Find anything interesting?" she asked, crossing her arms. Henry tapped the folder. "Nothing." "That's the problem." Leah's lips curled slightly. "Disappointed?" His patience snapped. "Cut the games, Leah. If you have something to say, say it." She tilted her head slightly, as if weighing her next words carefully. Then, she took a slow step closer. "All right," she said softly. "Let's play a game, Henry." He narrowed his eyes. Her voice was calm, almost teasing, but there was something dangerous lurking beneath it. "What kind of game?" he asked cautiously. Leah smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I'll give you 3 clues," she said. "If you can figure out who I am, I'll tell you everything." Henry clenched his jaw. "And if I don't?" Her expression darkened slightly. "Then maybe you're not as smart as you think you are." Something about that stung more than it should have. She took another step closer, until there were only inches between them. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Clue number 1, we've met before." Henry's pulse kicked up. That much he had already suspected, but hearing her confirm it made his stomach tighten. "Clue number 2, you hurt someone I loved." A chill ran through him. And then, she leaned in, close enough that he could smell the faintest trace of vanilla on her skin. "Clue number 3, you never even knew what you did." Silence stretched between them. Heavy. Suffocating. For the first time in years, Henry Lawson had no idea what to say. Leah pulled back, her green eyes locking onto his. "Think about it." Then she turned and walked out, leaving Henry standing there, heart pounding. He had built his life on being untouchable. But Leah Carter? She had just shaken his world. Henry had never been a man to dwell on the past. He built his life on moving forward, on focusing only on what was ahead. The past was irrelevant. But now, sitting alone in his study, Leah Carter's words echoed in his mind like a relentless drumbeat. "We've met before. You hurt someone I loved. And you never even knew what you did." It had been hours since she walked out of his office, but her voice still rang in his ears. Henry clenched his jaw and exhaled slowly. This was absurd. She was playing a game, trying to get inside his head. And worse, it was working. He had gone through her file. He had investigated her past. There was nothing that connected them. But that didn't mean the connection didn't exist. It just meant he hadn't found it yet. A cold sensation settled in his stomach. What if she was telling the truth? What if, at some point in his life, he had crossed paths with her? And what if he had hurt someone important to her, without even realizing it? The thought made his chest tighten in a way he didn't like. With a slow, controlled breath, Henry reached for his phone. His investigator picked up on the first ring. "Sir?" "Forget what I asked for before," Henry said, his voice calm but firm. "This time, I want something different." A brief silence. "What are you looking for?" Henry's grip tightened on the phone. "I need a list of every major business deal, lawsuit, acquisition, or termination I was involved in for the past 10 years, he said. Another pause. "That's a lot of information, sir." "I don't care. Get it to me." "Understood." Henry ended the call and leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. If Leah wasn't lying, if he really had hurt someone she loved, then the answer had to be buried somewhere in his past. And he was going to find it. The next morning, an encrypted file landed in his inbox. Henry opened it immediately. Scrolling through the endless list of names and deals, he searched for something, anything, that stood out. Old employees. Hostile takeovers. Fired executives. Former partners. Nothing. 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 Until he saw it. Daniel Carter. Henry stilled. The name tugged at something in the back of his mind. He frowned, clicking on the file. Daniel Carter. Former investment banker. Fired from a company Henry had acquired 7 years ago. Henry skimmed the details, his pulse slowing. The name was familiar, but he didn't remember the man personally. It had been a standard business move, a struggling firm, a necessary round of layoffs. Carter had been one of many employees let go. Nothing unusual. Nothing personal. Henry exhaled, shaking his head. This couldn't be it. But then, at the bottom of the file, a note caught his eye. Deceased, 5 years ago. A sharp pulse of unease went through him. He clicked on the attached report. Cause of death, suicide. Henry's breath caught. The words blurred slightly as he read them again. Daniel Carter had lost everything after being fired, his job, his home, his savings. His death had barely made the news, buried under more important headlines. It had meant nothing to Henry at the time. Just another nameless casualty in the business world. But now. Henry slowly set the file down, his mind racing. Carter. Leah Carter. His heart pounded as the realization settled over him. He hadn't just hurt someone she loved. He had destroyed him. Henry found her in the garden. She was sitting on one of the stone benches, her back to him, her hands resting on her lap. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the neatly trimmed hedges, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and pink. For a brief second, he hesitated. This wasn't a boardroom. This wasn't a negotiation. This was something else entirely. But Henry Lawson had never been a man to back down. He took a step forward, his shoes crunching against the gravel path. Leah. She didn't turn around. He clenched his jaw. She knew he was there. Tell me, he said, voice steady but firm. Tell me what I did. Slowly, she exhaled. Then, finally, she looked over her shoulder. You figured it out, then? She asked, her voice unreadable. Henry stepped closer. Your father. Something flickered in her eyes. Yes. It wasn't just confirmation. It was an accusation. Henry's stomach tightened. I didn't, he stopped himself, inhaling sharply. I didn't know. Leah's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. No, she said softly. You didn't. She stood, turning fully to face him. And that's the problem, isn't it? Henry narrowed his eyes. What's that supposed to mean? Leah took a slow step closer. You ruin lives, Henry. And you don't even notice. His jaw tightened. That's not fair. She let out a sharp, humorless laugh. Fair, she repeated. You think my father thought it was fair when he lost his job? When he lost everything? Henry's hands curled into fists at his sides. Your father wasn't the only one who got fired, he said, keeping his voice measured. It was business. It wasn't personal. Leah's eyes flashed. No, she snapped. It wasn't personal to you. But it was to us. Her words hit harder than he expected. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't crying. But her voice, it carried a weight that settled deep in his chest. My father worked his whole life to provide for us, she continued. And in one decision, one meeting, you took that away. Henry swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He had read the reports. He had seen the aftermath. Daniel Carter had lost his job. His career. His stability. And 5 years ago, he had lost his life. I didn't know, Henry said again, but this time, the words felt weak. Leah's gaze locked onto his. And that's why I'm here, she said. Henry exhaled slowly. So this was never about the money. Leah tilted her head slightly. Did you really think it was? He wasn't sure anymore. For the first time in a long time, he had no idea what came next. And he hated that more than anything. Henry didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study long after Leah had left, staring at the darkened city skyline through the massive glass windows. The whiskey in his glass remained untouched, the ice melting into a pool of diluted amber liquid. For the first time in years, his past refused to stay buried. He had always been good at compartmentalizing. Make the decision. Move on. Never look back. But now? Now, he saw Daniel Carter's name everywhere. He saw the man's face in the grainy, black and white photo from the investigation file. He saw the stark words on the death report. Suicide. Henry had never given the man a second thought before. He was just another number. Another piece of collateral damage in the world of high-stakes business. But to Leah, he had been everything. Henry exhaled slowly, running a hand over his face. He wasn't the type of man to drown in guilt. Guilt was useless. It didn't change the past. It didn't rewrite history. But still, something about the way Leah had looked at him today, so full of quiet, burning resentment, stayed with him. Had he really destroyed her father? Or had Daniel Carter simply been another casualty of a world that crushed the weak? Henry didn't know. And he hated not knowing. The next morning, he found Leah in the dining room. She was sitting at the far end of the long table, a cup of tea in her hands, staring out at the garden through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. She didn't look at him when he entered. Henry hesitated. He never hesitated. He walked over, pulling out the chair across from her. We need to talk. Leah let out a short, humorless laugh. Now you want to talk? Henry ignored the sting in her tone. I looked into your father. That got her attention. She slowly turned her head, her expression blank. And? Henry's fingers tapped against the polished wood of the table. I didn't know. Leah's lips pressed together. You keep saying that. Like it's supposed to mean something. It means something to me. She shook her head. No, Henry. It doesn't. Because you've spent your entire life not knowing. Not caring. His jaw tightened. That's not true. Isn't it? Leah tilted her head slightly. Tell me, do you even remember the day you fired him? Do you remember what he said? How he looked? Henry opened his mouth, then closed it. Because the truth was, he didn't remember. Not because he was lying, but because Daniel Carter had been one of dozens. Hundreds. Just another faceless employee in a system Henry had built to be ruthless. And Leah saw the answer in his silence. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. That's what I thought. Henry clenched his fists under the table. You blame me for his death. Leah took a slow sip of her tea. Don't you? The question landed harder than he expected. He wasn't sure how to answer it. Henry Lawson didn't apologize. Not in business. Not in life. Because apologies didn't fix things. They didn't bring back dead men. But for the first time, he wondered, had he truly been so blind? Henry had spent his entire life fixing problems. It was what made him successful. Something breaks? You fix it. Something fails? You replace it. But this? This wasn't something he could throw money at. And for the first time, Henry wasn't sure how to handle that. The conversation with Leah sat heavy in his chest. The way she had looked at him, not with anger, but with disappointment, had unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. She had expected nothing from him. That was the worst part. She hadn't confronted him for revenge. She hadn't demanded an apology. She had simply laid out the facts. And now Henry had to sit with them. He had been so sure of his place in the world, so certain that his decisions were logical, efficient, necessary. He had always believed that the strong survive, and the weak get left behind. But for the first time in his life, that belief felt hollow. He spent the rest of the evening pacing his office, replaying every moment of their conversation, every detail of her expression. And he hated the feeling settling in his gut. Regret. He found her in the library later that evening. She was curled up in one of the large leather chairs, reading. Or pretending to. Because when he stepped inside, her eyes didn't move over the page. She was waiting. I want to help, he said, standing in the doorway. Leah let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. Of course, you do. Henry frowned. What's that supposed to mean? She finally looked up. You think you can fix this? His jaw tightened. I don't know. She closed the book, resting it in her lap. You don't get it, do you? You can't fix this, Henry. My father is dead. You can't bring him back. I know that. Do you? Henry exhaled slowly. Let me do something. Anything. You need money, security, whatever. Leah stood abruptly. I don't want your money. Her voice wasn't raised, but it cut through him like a blade. Henry wasn't used to this. People always had a price. But Leah? She didn't want what he could give. And that was something he didn't know how to deal with. She shook her head. You don't get to buy your way out of this. Henry clenched his fists. I'm trying, Leah. For what? She shot back. To make yourself feel better? Silence stretched between them. And for the first time, Henry didn't have a response. Because maybe, she was right. Henry had never felt powerless before. His entire life had been built on control, over his company, his wealth, his choices. But standing here, facing Leah Carter, he realized there were things even he couldn't manipulate. Because this wasn't about business. This was about something real. And for the first time, he didn't know how to win. She watched him carefully, arms crossed over her chest. So what now, Henry? He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I don't know. She tilted her head slightly. That's a first. Henry let out a dry laugh, but there was no humor in it. I spent my whole life thinking I knew how the world worked, he admitted. You work hard. You make the right choices. You stay ahead. That's how you survive. Leah didn't interrupt. She just listened. But today, I realized something. His voice dropped slightly. It's easy to stay ahead when you never look back. Her expression flickered, but she said nothing. Henry swallowed hard. I never thought about the people I left behind. I didn't think it mattered. Leah's gaze was unreadable. And now? Henry met her eyes. Now I know I was wrong. Silence stretched between them. Henry had no idea what she was thinking. And for once in his life, he didn't try to predict the outcome. He simply waited. Leah inhaled slowly, then looked away. You can't change the past. I know. She turned back to him. So what do you want from me? Henry didn't answer right away. Then, finally, he said, nothing. Leah's brows furrowed slightly. Nothing? He nodded. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. He hesitated. I just needed you to know that I see it now. What I did. What it cost you. Leah studied him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she nodded. For the first time since this all began, there was no anger in her eyes. It wasn't forgiveness. But maybe, just maybe, it was the start of something else. And for Henry, that was enough. For now.